Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at Donald Miller, and I think this one is really going to be right up your alley.
Yeah, this is a fascinating case.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a serial killer here. Operated in Los Angeles back in the early 80s, targeted gay men.
And what's really interesting about this one is that we're not just going off of like the typical true crime,
Yeah.
kind of readily available information. We've actually got some
Yeah.
court documents and articles to work with here.
Yeah, we're going deep. We're going to uncover some stuff that you probably haven't heard before.
Yeah, and there are some twists and turns in this case, that's for sure.
Oh yeah. So let's get right into it.
Let's do it.
So, Donald Miller, born in 1941, grew up in LA. Seemingly, at first glance, pretty normal childhood, right? Like, no major red flags jumping out at us.
Yeah, pretty typical.
But what's interesting is how his criminal activity kind of escalated over time.
Yeah, it's like a slow burn that turned into a raging fire. So we're starting back in the 60s with some petty theft, moving into the 70s with violence against women.
I'm kind of curious about the early offenses. It seems like they were almost like a precursor to, or like a testing ground for the more
Yeah.
horrific crimes that would come later. Can you tell us about some of those early cases?
Absolutely. In 1975, Miller, using the alias Robert, picked up a hitchhiker named Bettina Grodman. He held her captive, drove her around for hours before assaulting her at his home, and thankfully she escaped and was able to report the incident.
Oh my gosh, that's terrifying. And it just, you would think that would be a major turning point.
You would think.
Right, a sign of like
Right.
what's to come and the
Yeah.
trajectory that he's on.
He was arrested for that, but because of some legal complexities and the nature of Grodman's past, he was only convicted of assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm.
So like a slap on the wrist for such a violent crime.
Essentially, yeah. And this pattern of violence just continued. In 1979, he gets into this heated argument with a coworker named John Harmon, throws hot coffee on him, threatens him with a steel pipe. It could have been a lot worse.
It's like he's pushing the limits, getting more and more aggressive.
Yeah, testing the boundaries. And then later that same year, he brutally attacks Linda Lee in a hotel elevator, leaving her unconscious with some pretty serious injuries.
It's just brutal. I mean, it just really underscores the escalating brutality of his actions. It's a clear indication that something has shifted.
Yeah, you're exactly right. This is like a turning point for Miller. From this point on, his focus narrows. He starts specifically targeting gay men
Wow. In and around Hollywood, right?
in and around Hollywood.
That's a chilling shift. I mean, it makes you wonder what could have triggered this change in his MO, you know?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah,
It's a question we may never have the answer to.
right.
But what is clear is that the brutality just escalates.
Yeah, let's get into those murders. So the first victim was Michael Thomas. He was a florist. He was found beaten to death in July of 1980. And there was a witness, Pam Kobach, who reported seeing two men near a dark-colored Datsun 280Z in the area.
Oh, that detail about the Datsun 280Z, that is important. It becomes a recurring element in the story, almost like Miller's calling card.
It's like a haunting symbol connecting all these crimes. And then just a few months later, the murder of Robert Sanderson, a hairstylist. He was last seen at a gay bar called the Rusty Nail. And at the crime scene, the police found a note with yellow Ford and a license plate number written on it.
It's just the brutality is just relentless. In January 1981, we have Danny Harmon, a young man experiencing homelessness, vanishes from a gay bar. Body later found, like the others, fatal blows to the head.
So we have three murders, all occurring near gay bars late at night, all with the same MO. Blunt force trauma to the head, suggesting a signature weapon. And none of them robbed, right?
Right.
Which suggests something else is driving these attacks.
Exactly. No robbery, so it points to something more sinister, maybe hatred, maybe rage,
Yeah,
fueling these
a
attacks.
disturbing pattern for sure. And then in February of 1981, Miller encounters Ernesto Ramirez at the Rusty Nail. This one becomes a real turning point in the investigation. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, Miller offers Ramirez a ride, and as with the others, drives him to a secluded location, attacks him with a steel pipe.
But Ramirez, he survives the initial attack.
He does, but he's left in a coma and tragically passes away 2 months later. But his friend, Mario Aguirre, had actually witnessed Miller leaving the Rusty Nail with Ramirez.
Oh, wow. So that eyewitness account really helped to crack this case wide open.
Absolutely. Aguirre helps the police create a sketch of Miller, which was widely circulated. And then Aguirre, he's determined to bring his friend's attacker to justice, joins the police in a stakeout near the Rusty Nail, and unbelievably spots Miller heading towards the bar.
Wow. Talk about a break in the case.
I know, right? The police are able to apprehend him.
And during a search, they found keys to a black Datsun 280Z.
The plot thickens.
Right. The same type of car the witness described seeing near Michael Thomas's body, they track down the car and inside they find a steel pipe.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's looking pretty bad for Donald Miller at this point. He gets arrested, he's charged with the murders.
It is, and as investigators dig deeper into Miller's past, they uncover even more disturbing assaults that predate the murders.
Wow, so it just keeps getting deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
This is where things get really, really interesting. But we'll have to save that story for part 2 of our deep dive. It's crazy how they just kept finding more and more, right?
Yeah, it's like pulling a thread on a sweater and the whole thing unravels.
Exactly. It really does make you wonder if those murders were just like the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that a lot of these assaults happened like in broad daylight or in public areas, it's a level of boldness that's just
Hmm.
shocking, really.
It really is. Like, he felt untouchable almost. You mentioned some specific assaults that came to light after Miller's arrest. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, there's one that really stands out. Involves a man named Richard Salita. He was visiting L.A. from Chicago back in May of 1980, and he reports being approached by a man in, you guessed it, a dark-colored Datsun 280Z.
That car, man, that car just keeps popping up.
I know, right? It's like his signature. So Salita says this man, who matched Miller's description, offered him money for sexual favors, but he refused. But later that night, Salita ran into the same guy again and accepted a ride. And the man drove him to a secluded alley and attacked him with a metal pipe.
God, it's like with each encounter, he's getting more and more brazen, you know?
Yeah, like he's testing the limits, seeing how far he can push it.
Yeah.
And then, in October of that same year, another man, Rodolfo Pambide, has a similar experience. Approached by a man in a Datsun 280Z, offered a ride, driven to an isolated spot, and the man tries to attack him with a heavy object.
It's that same pattern, right?
Exactly.
The Datsun, the secluded location, the sudden violence, it's chilling.
It's a terrifying MO for sure. Luckily, Pambid managed to escape, but his testimony, along with Salita's, provided more evidence of this pattern of targeting men in and around the gay bar scene.
And we also have the case of Michael Piatilla. He actually knew Miller casually from the Bay Bar scene. And guess what? Offered a ride, taken to a secluded location, and attacked.
It's unbelievable how this pattern just keeps repeating.
I know.
And what's interesting about Piatilla's case is that he knew Miller by the name Robert, which, if you remember, is the same alias Miller used when he assaulted Bettina Gardman back in '75.
Oh, wow, you're right. It's crazy how those seemingly unconnected pieces of information start to, like, fit together, right?
It's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle of this guy's criminal history.
Yeah.
And then just days before Miller's arrest, there's another attack, this time on Douglas Allison.
Yeah, and this one was particularly brutal, right?
It was. Allison was beaten so severely that he was left in a coma for 2 months and suffered from amnesia.
Oh my God. It's just the trauma that these victims endured is just, it's unfathomable.
Absolutely. And while Allison couldn't remember specifics about his attacker, he did recall that the man was black, which matched witness descriptions of Miller.
So with all this evidence, the witness testimonies, the clear pattern of behavior, it seems like it'd be a pretty open and shut case, right?
Well, you would think so, but this is where things get a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
You see, the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence.
Okay, so there wasn't that like one smoking gun, that one piece of evidence that directly linked Miller to the murders.
Exactly. Now, the steel pipe found in his car was definitely a strong piece of evidence, but there was no trace of the victim's blood or DNA on it. And the defense, they really hammered that point home.
So how did the prosecution build their case without that like concrete physical evidence?
Well, they relied heavily on those witness testimonies, especially those who had seen that Datsun 280Z near the crime scenes. They also pointed out the similarities in the murders, that pattern of blunt force trauma to the head, the fact that none of the victims were robbed. They argued that all of this pointed to a motive of hatred or rage.
So they were trying to create a narrative, like a profile of Miller as this predator, specifically targeting gay men.
Exactly. They argued that his history of violence against women back in the '70s sort of culminated in these targeted attacks.
Okay. But didn't Miller maintain his innocence throughout all of this?
He did, initially. Denied any involvement in the murders, claimed he couldn't remember where he was during the times of the attacks, kind of a classic defense tactic.
Yeah, for sure.
But as the trial went on, his behavior took a strange turn. He started arguing with his attorney and demanding a guilty plea.
Wait, really? Why would he do that? What are your thoughts on that? Was it like genuine remorse? Was it a legal strategy? Or was there something else going on entirely?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some people think it was a genuine expression of guilt, a desire to take responsibility for what he had done. Others believe it might have been a calculated move to avoid a lengthy trial. maybe get a lighter sentence.
It's a fascinating psychological puzzle.
It really is. But regardless of his motivations, that guilty plea sealed his fate. In October of 1983, the jury found him guilty on all counts and sentenced him to death.
So justice was served, but it still seems like there are so many unanswered questions.
Oh, absolutely. And the story doesn't end there. Even after Miller's death, there's this whole other chapter that adds another layer of complexity to this already perplexing case.
So, okay, Miller's in prison, convicted, he's on death row. You'd think that's the end of the story, right?
You would think so, right? Like case closed. But you remember how we were talking about those investigators, like how they just kept digging and digging?
Yeah, like they just wouldn't let go of this. They kept finding more and more.
Exactly, and this is where it gets really crazy. In 2006, just a year after Miller died in prison, DNA evidence linked him to a cold case from 1977.
Hold on, 1977, that's before the assaults on women even started.
Yeah.
This wasn't just another assault, was it?
No, this was a murder. The victim was a young woman named Camilla Stase, a college student, a musician, living in Long Beach.
It's like we're going all the way back to the beginning before any of the stuff we've been talking about even happened.
Right, and it really makes you think, how much did we actually know about this guy?
So what happened to Camilla?
She was found murdered in her apartment, brutally stabbed to death. And there was evidence of sexual assault.
It's just awful. And this case went unsolved for years. Nobody even connected it to Donald Miller until after he was already gone.
It really makes you wonder how many other cases might be out there. Cases that could be linked to Miller or to other, perpetrators. It's kind of scary to think about.
It is. Even though Miller died in prison, it's almost like there's no real sense of closure. It just adds another layer of tragedy to the whole thing.
Yeah, you're right. It's like a puzzle with some pieces still missing.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Donald Miller, what are some things you hope our listeners take away from all this?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that evil can wear a very normal mask. Miller blended in. He seemed like an ordinary guy. And it's important to remember that you can't always judge a book by its cover.
That's so true. And it also shows that sometimes justice takes a long time.
It does. Sometimes it takes years, decades even, for the truth to come out. And sometimes, as we saw with Camilla Stase, the truth comes out too late.
Well, this has been heavy. Thanks for taking us down this dark path.
You're welcome. It's definitely a case that makes you think.
If any of our listeners out there want to dig deeper, there's tons of info available. Court documents, news articles, even some books on the case. Go explore. Who knows what else you might find.
That's right. Happy digging, everyone.
And until next time, stay curious.